There's a version of piracy that lives in movies and theme park rides, a world of tricorn hats and black flags, of buried treasure and plank walking and swashbuckling adventure on the high seas. That version is not entirely wrong. It's just incomplete. The real history of piracy is richer, stranger, and more morally complex than any Hollywood production has managed to capture. It's also much older. Piracy is not a product of the 17th and 18th centuries. It's as old as seafaring itself, which means it's been part of the ocean's human history for as long as ships have carried anything worth stealing. The Golden Age of Piracy, which ran roughly from the 1680s to the 1730s, is the period most people picture when they hear the word pirate. It's the era of Blackbeard and Bartholomew Roberts, of Nassau in the Bahamas as a pirate republic, of ships flying the Jolly Roger in the Caribbean and along the trade routes of the Atlantic. That era is real, and it's genuinely fascinating, and we'll spend a lot of time in it. But to understand why it happened when it did, you need to understand the world that produced it. That world was shaped by three things above all others. The first was the explosion of Atlantic trade in the 17th century, as European empires built vast networks of ships carrying silver, sugar, tobacco, and manufactured goods across the ocean in both directions. The second was a series of European wars that created large numbers of trained sailors and privateers, men licensed by governments to attack enemy ships, and then ended abruptly, leaving those men without employment or income. The third was the particular geography of the Caribbean, with its hundreds of islands, hidden coves, and trade wind routes that made it an almost perfect operating environment for small, fast ships with violent intent. Pirates have appeared in every era of ocean history and in every part of the world where ships carried cargo worth taking. The ancient Mediterranean had pirates. The Vikings were, among other things, pirates, though the Norse themselves would have used a different word. The Barbary coast of North Africa produced corsairs who raided European shipping for centuries. Chinese pirates organized themselves into fleets larger than most national navies. Japanese pirates called Waco terrorized the shipping lanes of East Asia for hundreds of years. Piracy is not a quirk of one time or one place. It's a persistent feature of the ocean wherever trade flows and enforcement is weak. What makes the Golden Age so historically significant is not the scale of its violence, which was real but not exceptional by historical standards, but the way it intersected with the birth of the modern global economy. The pirates of the Caribbean were not simply robbers at sea. They were, in many cases, former employees of that global economy who had been discarded by it, turned against it, and developed within their ships an alternative social structure that was, by the standards of the era, surprisingly democratic. Understanding them means understanding something about the tensions built into the early modern world. Piracy also raises questions that go beyond history and into political philosophy. When does violence at sea become legitimate? Who has the right to decide what ships can sail where? The pirates of the Caribbean didn't ask those questions in those terms, but their existence forced the governments and trading companies of Europe to answer them. The legal frameworks built to suppress piracy, the international maritime law that developed in the 18th and 19th centuries, is partly a product of the pressure piracy applied to systems of ocean governance that hadn't kept pace with the explosion of Atlantic trade. That tension between freedom and violence, between the romance of the outlaw and the reality of the harm they caused is what makes piracy enduringly interesting as a subject of history. Understanding the Golden Age also means understanding that the word pirate was itself a legal and political construction as much as a description of behaviour. The same man doing the same things could be a privateer or a pirate, depending on whether his government was currently at war with the government of the ship he was attacking. That ambiguity shaped the entire era. To understand where the pirates of the Golden Age came from, you have to understand privateering, which is essentially state-sponsored piracy with paperwork. A privateer was a private ship captain who had been issued a letter of marque by a government, giving them legal permission to attack and capture the ships of enemy nations during wartime. The distinction between a privateer and a pirate was, in theory, clear. A privateer had government authorization. A pirate didn't. In practice, the line was blurry enough to be almost meaningless, and many of the most famous pirates of the Golden Age began their careers as perfectly legitimate privateers. England, France, and the Netherlands used privateers extensively during the 17th century as a way of harassing Spanish shipping without committing to open war. Spain had built its Atlantic empire on the silver and gold extracted from its American colonies, and that wealth flowed back to Spain in a regular convoy system, the flota, that made Spanish treasure ships a target of enormous appeal. English privateers, like Francis Drake, had been attacking Spanish shipping since the 1570s with the unofficial blessing of the Crown, a practice that enriched both the privateers and, through a share of the proceeds, the English government. The privateering system created a large, experienced, sea-going labour force trained in exactly the skills piracy required: navigation, gunnery, boarding tactics, and the management of captured prizes. When the major European wars of the late 17th century ended, particularly the War of the Spanish Succession, which concluded in 1713, those men found themselves suddenly unemployed. The governments that had licensed and encouraged them during wartime had no further use for them in peacetime. The ships were laid up, the letters of marque were revoked, and tens of thousands of experienced sailors were turned loose with no income, no prospects, and a very specific set of skills that were difficult to apply to any legitimate occupation. Many of them went to the Caribbean, where the infrastructure of Atlantic trade was concentrated, and where the enforcement of maritime law was, to put it charitably, inconsistent. The Caribbean in the early 18th century was a place of enormous wealth and enormous disorder. The plantation economies of the islands were producing sugar, tobacco, and other commodities that made their way back to Europe on ships carrying cash and goods in both directions. Colonial governments were understaffed, underfunded, and often corrupt. Royal Navy presence was limited, and scattered among hundreds of islands were any number of remote anchorages where a ship could be careened, repaired, and re-provisioned without attracting official attention. The Caribbean also offered something that made it uniquely suited to piracy beyond its geography. Colonial governance was thin, inconsistent, and frequently corrupt. Local governors who were supposed to suppress piracy often found it more profitable to tolerate it, accepting a share of prize goods in exchange for looking the other way. Port merchants, who were supposed to refuse stolen cargo, often bought it happily at discounted prices. Piracy in the Caribbean survived not despite the colonial establishment, but in many cases with its quiet cooperation, and ending it required cleaning up a system of low-level corruption that ran from the docks to the governor's house. Into this environment came the men who would become the pirates of the Golden Age, carrying with them the navigation charts, the gunnery skills, and the organisational knowledge of the privateer trade, but now working for themselves rather than for any government. The transition from privateer to pirate was, for many of them, a small step rather than a dramatic reinvention. They were already at sea, already armed, already practiced at taking ships. The only thing that had changed was the piece of paper in the captain's cabin. The career of Henry Morgan illustrates how thin that line really was. Morgan attacked and sacked the city of Panama in 1671, one of the most audacious military operations in Caribbean history, did so under a letter of marque from the governor of Jamaica, and ended up not hanged but knighted and appointed lieutenant governor of Jamaica. Whether he was a pirate or a privateer depended entirely on which side of a peace treaty his activities fell on. The pirate ships of the Golden Age were not the massive galleons of popular imagination. They were, for the most part, small and fast, designed for speed and manoeuvrability rather than cargo capacity or firepower. The most common pirate vessel was the sloop, a single-masted ship of perhaps 50 to 100 tons that could be sailed by a small crew, operated in shallow coastal waters, and outrun most of the merchant ships it was likely to encounter. Speed was the pirate's most important tactical asset. A faster ship could choose whether to engage or escape, and that freedom of choice was everything. Piracy in the Golden Age worked on psychology as much as it worked on violence. A pirate crew attacking a merchant vessel was almost always outnumbered by the merchant crew and outgunned by any naval escort. What they had instead was reputation. A ship that raised the Jolly Roger, the skull and crossbones flag that became the symbol of piracy in this period, was broadcasting a very specific message. Surrender now, and you'll be treated reasonably. Resist, and things will go badly for you. The flag was a negotiating tool as much as a threat, and it worked because the alternatives were genuinely frightening. Different pirate captains flew different versions of the black flag. Blackbeard's flag reportedly showed a skeleton holding an hourglass and a spear pointing at a bleeding heart. Bartholomew Roberts flew a figure of himself standing on two skulls. These were not random designs. They were carefully constructed signals meant to communicate the captain's reputation and intentions to the captains of ships that encountered them. The flag was, in a sense, a brand, and in a world without radio or telegraph, the visual vocabulary of piracy was one of the few ways a pirate crew could communicate across the water before coming within hailing distance. Life aboard a pirate ship was governed by articles, a written set of rules that every crew member signed before the voyage. These articles covered the distribution of prize money, the compensation for injuries sustained in battle, the rules of conduct on board, and the process for resolving disputes. They were, in essence, a contract between the crew and the captain. What's striking about them is how democratic they were by the standards of the era. On most pirate ships, the crew voted on major decisions, including where to sail, whether to attack a particular target, and whether to replace a captain who had lost the crew's confidence. This internal democracy stood in sharp contrast to the conditions aboard the naval and merchant ships from which many pirates had come. Naval life in the early 18th century was brutal by almost any measure. Discipline was enforced by flogging. Pay was irregular and often withheld. Officers could be arbitrary and violent. The mortality rate from disease, accident and combat was genuinely appalling. When sailors deserted to pirate crews, they were frequently not running towards something lawless, but away from something worse. The diet and health conditions aboard pirate ships weren't dramatically better than those aboard naval or merchant vessels. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was a constant threat on any long ocean voyage in this era, and pirates were no exception. Fresh water spoiled quickly in tropical heat. Meat was preserved in salt and was frequently rancid by the time it was eaten. The romantic image of the pirate life didn't include a great deal of fresh fruit, and the mortality from disease on pirate ships was probably comparable to or higher than on naval vessels, though the records are too sparse to be precise. The articles that governed pirate ships also addressed something the legitimate maritime world rarely did: compensation for injury. Many pirate articles included specific schedules of payment for crew members who lost limbs or eyes in battle, a form of disability insurance that existed nowhere in legitimate seafaring at the time. A pirate who lost his right arm in battle might receive 600 pieces of 8. One who lost an eye received 100. These weren't generous amounts by modern standards, but they represented a recognition of the crew members' contribution and the risks they'd taken that had no equivalent aboard a naval or merchant vessel of the same era. No figure in the history of piracy has cast a longer shadow than Edward Teach, known to his contemporaries and to history as Blackbeard. He was active for only about 2 years, from 1716 to 1718, and in that short time he became the most feared pirate in the Atlantic world and established a reputation that has never entirely faded. Understanding Blackbeard means understanding how reputation worked in the age of piracy and how deliberately and skillfully some pirates constructed and maintained the image that was their most powerful weapon. Blackbeard's real name may have been Edward Teach, though the historical record is uncertain even on this point. What's clear is that he was an experienced sailor who had worked as a privateer during the War of the Spanish Succession and transitioned to piracy after the war ended. By 1717, he was operating in the Caribbean and along the American colonial coast, commanding a former French slave ship that he'd captured and converted into his flagship, which he renamed Queen Anne's Revenge. She carried 40 guns, making her one of the most formidable warships outside of national navies in the Atlantic at the time. Blackbeard's physical appearance became legendary in his own lifetime. He was a large man with an exceptionally thick black beard that he reportedly wore tied into sections with ribbons. Before battle, he'd weave slow-burning fuses into his hair and beard and light them so that smoke curled around his face as he boarded enemy ships. Whether this was genuine intimidation, theatrical psychology, or some combination of both, it worked. Merchant captains who encountered Blackbeard generally surrendered without fighting, which was exactly what he wanted. A battle risked his ship and his crew. Surrender risked nothing. In the spring of 1718, Blackbeard pulled off one of the boldest acts of piracy in the Golden Age. He blockaded the port of Charleston, South Carolina, with a small fleet, stopping every ship entering or leaving the harbour for several days. He held passengers from captured ships as hostages and demanded a chest of medicines as ransom. The colonial government of South Carolina was helpless. There was no naval force available to break the blockade. They paid the ransom, and Blackbeard sailed away. The incident humiliated the colonial establishment and demonstrated how vulnerable Atlantic trade had become to determined piracy. Blackbeard was killed in November 1718 in a battle off the coast of North Carolina in an engagement organised by the governor of Virginia, who had grown tired of Blackbeard's use of North Carolina's inlets as a base of operations. A naval lieutenant named Robert Maynard led 2 small vessels against Blackbeard's sloop, and, after a ferocious battle in which Blackbeard reportedly sustained 5 bullet wounds and multiple sword cuts before finally dying, the pirate era's most famous figure was gone. His story, from beginning to end, had lasted approximately 2 years. He had demonstrated both the vulnerability of Atlantic trade and the ability of a determined government to end that vulnerability when it decided to act. 2 lessons that were absorbed, not forgotten, and acted on in the years that followed. The story of Blackbeard's career is also a story about the complicated politics of colonial governance. North Carolina in 1718 was a poor, sparsely settled colony with a corrupt governor, a weak militia, and no naval forces of its own. It was exactly the kind of place where a pirate could operate with a degree of protection. Blackbeard reportedly had an informal arrangement with the governor of North Carolina, Charles Eden, that gave him shelter in exchange for a share of his prizes. It was the governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, who found this intolerable and organised the expedition that killed him, acting outside his own jurisdiction to do so. The killing of Blackbeard was itself a small constitutional crisis, raising questions about which colonial governor had the authority to conduct military operations in another colony's waters. The most successful pirate of the Golden Age wasn't Blackbeard. By almost any measure, ships taken, distance covered, prize money accumulated, length of career, that title belongs to Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, who operated from 1719 to 1722 and captured an estimated 400 ships in less than 3 years. He's less famous than Blackbeard, largely because his story has fewer dramatic theatrical elements and more straightforward, relentless competence, which makes for a less cinematic narrative but a more remarkable historical record. Roberts was Welsh, and he came to piracy later in life than most, having been a legitimate merchant sailor well into his 30s before his ship was captured by pirates in 1719. He was pressed into the pirate crew, apparently without much resistance, and within weeks had so impressed the crew with his navigational skill and his leadership that when the captain was killed in a raid, the crew voted Roberts into command. He accepted the position with a remark that has been quoted ever since, that it was better to be a commander than a common man, and since an honest service offered nothing but low wages and hard labour, a merry life and a short one would have to do. Roberts operated across an enormous geographic range, from the Caribbean to the coast of West Africa to the waters off Brazil. He took ships from almost every European maritime nation. He attacked ports directly, burning ships at anchor when he couldn't take them as prizes. He developed a reputation for being reasonable with crews that surrendered, and severe with those that resisted, which kept his surrender rate high and his battle losses low. His articles, the written rules of his ship, survive and are among the most detailed documents we have of how pirate ships actually governed themselves. His articles give a clear picture of life aboard a well-run pirate vessel. Every man had a vote in major decisions. The captain and the quartermaster got a larger share of prize money than ordinary crew, but not dramatically more. Gambling was prohibited. Lights had to be out by 8 in the evening, though men who wanted to keep drinking after that could do so on deck. Any man who deserted before a prize was taken would be marooned or executed. These weren't the rules of an anarchic mob. They were the rules of a functioning maritime organisation that happened to be engaged in systematic robbery. Roberts's career also illustrates something important about the economics of the Golden Age at its peak. By 1720, the Atlantic was well enough patrolled that the most productive hunting grounds had shifted to the coast of West Africa, where slave ships, merchant vessels, and Portuguese gold ships created a rich and relatively unprotected target pool. Roberts and his crews operated there for extended periods, taking prizes from multiple European nations. The globalization of piracy in this period reflected the globalization of Atlantic trade itself, with pirate crews following the routes of greatest wealth wherever those routes led. Roberts was killed in February 1722 off the coast of West Africa when a Royal Navy warship caught his fleet at anchor, most of the crew drunk after celebrating a prize. He died in the first exchange of fire, which ended the engagement quickly since the crew had no particular interest in fighting without their captain. His body was thrown overboard before it could be captured. More than 200 of his crew were taken prisoner, and 54 of them were hanged. In a career of less than 3 years, Roberts had done more damage to Atlantic shipping than any other single pirate in the Golden Age, not through exceptional violence, but through exceptional organisation and an almost professional approach to a fundamentally criminal enterprise. Roberts's story also illustrates the diversity of pirate crews in the Golden Age. His articles specified that any crew member who brought a boy or a woman aboard was to be put to death, a rule that reflected the practical concerns of a ship where violence was always close to the surface. But his crews included men of multiple nationalities and races. Enslaved Africans, taken from slave ships, sometimes joined pirate crews willingly, and some rose to positions of genuine responsibility. The pirate ship wasn't an egalitarian paradise, but it was in some respects more open to men of different backgrounds than the strictly hierarchical world of legitimate seafaring. The story of piracy is not exclusively a story about men. Anne Bonny and Mary Read are the two most famous female pirates of the Golden Age, and their stories have attracted attention ever since, though the historical record is thin enough that separating fact from legend requires caution. What is documented is that both women sailed with the pirate calico Jack Rackham in 1720, that both were discovered to be women when the crew was captured, and that both were tried for piracy in Jamaica. Anne Bonny was reportedly born in Ireland and raised in South Carolina, where her father had become a successful planter. She married a small-time sailor named James Bonny against her father's wishes, which led to her being cut off from the family money. She met Calico Jack in Nassau and joined his crew. Mary Read's origin story is even more tangled. According to accounts written after her trial, she'd been raised as a boy by her mother, possibly to claim an inheritance, and had spent time disguised as a man serving in the British Army before ending up at sea. Whether all of this is true is impossible to verify. What the trial record confirms is that she was on Rackham's ship, dressed in men's clothing when captured. The capture of Calico Jack's crew is one of the more inglorious episodes in the history of Golden Age piracy. A privateer sloop caught them at anchor near the western tip of Jamaica at night, and most of the crew was too drunk to fight. The accounts of the trial record that Bonnie and Red, along with one other crew member, were the only ones who actually came up on deck to defend the ship. The rest, including Calico Jack himself, stayed below. Rackham and most of his crew were hanged. Both women pleaded their bellies, the legal term for claiming pregnancy, which delayed execution. Mary Red died in prison, apparently of fever, before the sentence could be carried out. Anne Bonny's ultimate fate is unknown. She disappears from the historical record after her trial, leaving behind one of the more tantalizing unsolved mysteries of the Golden Age. Beyond the romance of their individual stories, Bonnie and Reed are significant because they exist at all in the historical record. The Golden Age of Piracy was a world in which the normal constraints of European society were significantly loosened, and the evidence from multiple pirate crews suggests that gender boundaries were among the things that could be renegotiated at sea. The pirate ship's articles, its collective decision-making, and its distance from the institutions of European law created a space in which things that were impossible on land became at least possible. The pirate ship was never a utopia, and life aboard one was genuinely dangerous, uncomfortable, and likely to end badly. But for certain people, in certain circumstances, it offered something the legitimate world didn't, and the stories of Bonnie and Reed suggest that the offer was open to more people than history usually admits. The history of women at sea in the early modern period is broader than just the pirate story, though the pirate story is its most dramatic chapter. Women disguised as men served in European armies and navies throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, a fact that was occasionally discovered and occasionally accommodated by the institutions that employed them. The sea, like the army, was a place where a determined person could sometimes construct an identity that land-based society would not have permitted. The distance from established authority that made piracy possible also made other kinds of reinvention possible, and Bonnie and Red's story sits within a larger pattern of women who found in maritime and military life a freedom that civilian life denied them. None of this made the pirate world safe or just, but it made it, for some people, preferable to what waited for them on shore. The two women also left a permanent mark on how the Golden Age has been remembered. Their presence in the trial records ensured that the story of Caribbean piracy could never be told as an entirely male story. And writers, playwrights, and filmmakers have returned to them repeatedly in the 3 centuries since their trial, finding in their lives a richness that the sparse documentary record barely hints at. The Golden Age of Piracy ended not because pirates became less dangerous, but because the world they operated in changed around them. The key shift was political and economic rather than military. As the major European powers consolidated their Atlantic empires in the early 18th century, They developed both the motivation and the means to suppress piracy in a way they hadn't before. The cost of tolerating piracy, which had once been offset by the convenience of having privateers available for wartime, became politically and commercially unacceptable as trade volumes grew and merchant interests gained power. The Royal Navy's expansion into the Caribbean and along the American colonial coast in the 1710s and 1720s was the decisive military factor. A series of dedicated anti-piracy campaigns, the Piracy Act of 1717, which offered pardons to pirates who surrendered, and the systematic trial and execution of captured pirates, all combined to raise the cost of piracy dramatically. The pardon offer was particularly effective. Many pirates, including some significant figures, accepted the amnesty and retired. Those who didn't found themselves operating in an increasingly hostile environment with fewer safe harbours and a much greater risk of hanging. The pardon system that Woodes-Rogers implemented in Nassau in 1718 represents a more sophisticated response to piracy than simple military suppression. The Crown's calculation was that offering amnesty to pirates who surrendered would be cheaper and faster than hunting them all down, and that the men who refused the pardon would be fewer in number and easier to identify as genuine criminals. The strategy worked reasonably well. Many significant pirates accepted the pardon, and the ones who didn't, including Blackbeard, were hunted with a political will that hadn't existed before. The loss of Nassau as a base of operations was particularly significant. Nassau in the Bahamas had functioned as something close to a pirate republic in the early 18th century. A harbour where pirate crews could sell prizes, refit their ships, recruit crew, and spend their money in relative safety. In 1718, the British Crown sent Rogers to Nassau with a naval escort and a mandate to clean it up. He arrived with the pardon offer in one hand and the threat of force in the other. Most of the pirates in Nassau accepted the pardon. Rogers then built the fortifications and legal infrastructure that made Nassau genuinely inhospitable to piracy. The trial and execution of pirates was conducted as public theatre, deliberately designed to communicate that the era of tolerance was over. Hangings were held in public, and the bodies of executed pirates were sometimes gibbeted, displayed in iron cages at harbour entrances as a warning to passing sailors. The execution of more than 50 of Bartholomew Roberts's crew in West Africa in 1722 was explicitly intended as a demonstration, and it worked. After 1722, organised Atlantic piracy at the scale of the Golden Age never returned. What replaced it was smaller in scale and more localised. Pirates continued to operate in the Indian Ocean, in the waters of Southeast Asia, and in the Mediterranean for centuries after the Caribbean Golden Age ended. The Barbary corsairs of North Africa continued raiding European shipping into the 19th century. Chinese piracy reached its peak in the early 19th century under Madame Qing, who commanded a confederation of hundreds of ships. But none of it had quite the same combination of romantic myth and documentary record that made the Caribbean Golden Age the version of piracy that stayed with us. The transition from the Golden Age to the suppressed aftermath also had an important geographic dimension. As the Caribbean was cleaned up, piracy migrated rather than disappeared entirely. The Indian Ocean, which had been a pirate hunting ground throughout the Golden Age as well, continued to attract pirates operating out of Madagascar and the East African coast well into the 1720s. Henry Every, who seized a Mughal treasure ship in 1695 in one of the most lucrative pirate attacks in history, had operated in the Indian Ocean. The Red Sea and the Persian Gulf also hosted piracy that was connected to the Caribbean Golden Age through shared crews and shared techniques, if not shared geography. The pirates of the Golden Age have had an outsized influence on popular culture that bears almost no relationship to how common or how powerful they actually were. At their peak, there were probably no more than a few thousand active pirates in the Atlantic, operating perhaps 20 or 30 ships at any one time. They were a genuine nuisance to Atlantic trade and a real source of anxiety to colonial governments, but they were never a serious threat to the empires they preyed on. Their outsized reputation, then and now, is a product of the same thing that made them effective in their own time: the power of the story they told about themselves. The romanticization of piracy began almost as soon as the Golden Age ended. Daniel Defoe, writing under the pen name Captain Charles Johnson, published A General History of the Pirates in 1724, just 2 years after the end of the Golden Age. It was an immediate bestseller, and it established the literary template for piracy that has persisted ever since. Johnson's pirates were colourful, quotable, and morally complex in ways that made them compelling reading. Some of what Johnson wrote was accurate, some of it was embellished, some of it appears to have been invented entirely. The book was so influential that it's almost impossible to separate what later generations believed about pirates from what Johnson decided to tell them. Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, published in 1883, took the Johnson template and transformed it into the adventure story that defined piracy for generations of readers. Long John Silver, the one-legged sea cook with the parrot on his shoulder, is perhaps the most influential fictional pirate ever created, and almost nothing about him accurately reflects the historical reality of Golden Age piracy. But Treasure Island was never trying to be history. It was trying to be a story, and as a story, it succeeded so completely that its imagery became essentially permanent in Western culture. The parrot, the treasure map, the black spot, the buried chest, all Stevenson, not history. The deeper appeal of the pirate story in Western culture is worth thinking about. Pirates occupy a particular cultural space as outsiders who rejected the rules of the society they came from and built an alternative world beyond the reach of law. That's a fantasy with genuine emotional appeal, especially to people living within institutions that feel constraining or unjust. The fact that real pirates were often violent, frequently brutal, and generally died young and badly does relatively little to diminish the fantasy, because the fantasy isn't really about the pirates. It's about the freedom they seem to represent. The cultural staying power of the pirate image is also connected to something specific about the era in which it was most thoroughly romanticized. The 19th century, when Stevenson wrote Treasure Island, was an era of rigid social hierarchy, industrial labour discipline, and imperial expansion. The pirate represented everything that Victorian society was not: free, lawless, egalitarian in a rough way, and answerable to no employer or government. That the real pirates had mostly died horribly in their 20s and 30s was beside the point. The fantasy was the point. There's also something genuinely interesting in the historical record about the social organisation of pirate ships that cuts through the romance to something more substantive. The democratic articles, the collective decision-making, the relatively egalitarian distribution of prize money, these were real features of real pirate ships, documented in trial records and captured articles. Some historians have argued that the pirate ship represented a genuine alternative social experiment, a floating democracy at a time when democracy barely existed anywhere on land. Whether that's too romantic a reading is debatable, but the basic facts are real, and they're more interesting than anything Hollywood has invented. What the historical record of the Golden Age actually offers, if you read it carefully, is something more interesting than either pure romance or pure villainy. It offers a window into the lives of ordinary men at the bottom of the 18th century maritime world. Men who were expendable to the economic system that employed them and who responded to that expendability in the most dramatic way available. The pirate ship was an imperfect and violent solution to a real problem. Piracy still exists. That's worth saying clearly, because the Golden Age framing can make it feel like a closed chapter of history rather than an ongoing reality. In 2010 and 2011, Somali pirates were attacking ships in the Gulf of Aden at a rate of several per week, holding crews hostage for ransoms that sometimes reached millions of dollars. In the Strait of Malacca, one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, piracy has been a persistent problem for decades. In the Gulf of Guinea, off West Africa, piracy has increased significantly in recent years and is now considered one of the most dangerous maritime regions in the world. Modern piracy looks very different from the Golden Age version, but the underlying logic is remarkably similar. It emerges in places where trade routes concentrate wealth, where state authority over the sea is weak or absent, and where economic conditions push people toward high-risk criminal activity as an alternative to poverty. Somali piracy developed in the context of a failed state with no functioning coast guard, a fishing industry devastated by illegal foreign trawling, and a population with very limited economic alternatives. The men who became pirates weren't romantics. They were economic actors responding to incentives in a rational, if desperate way. The mechanics of modern piracy are also instructive. Somali pirates didn't usually try to take cargo, which is difficult to move and sell without an extensive criminal network. Instead, they took the crew and the ship as hostages, negotiating ransom with the shipping companies through intermediaries while keeping the crew in conditions that ranged from uncomfortable to genuinely dangerous. The ransoms paid, sometimes through channels crossing multiple jurisdictions and legal grey areas, represented a significant income stream that at its peak was estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars per year flowing into the Somali coastal economy. The suppression of Somali piracy in the early 2000s followed a pattern that would have been recognizable to the governors who suppressed the Golden Age. Naval forces from multiple nations began patrolling the Gulf of Aden, making attacks more dangerous. Shipping companies hired armed security guards, which dramatically raised the cost of any attempted boarding. The combination of increased enforcement and hardened targets reduced the attack rate sharply, though piracy in the region never entirely disappeared. When conditions in Somalia improved slightly and naval patrols intensified, the economics of piracy shifted enough that many former pirates found other ways to make a living. The history of piracy, from the ancient Mediterranean to the modern Gulf of Guinea, tells us something consistent about the relationship between trade, law, and violence on the ocean. Piracy fills the gaps. It appears wherever valuable goods move across water in conditions where the cost of protection is high and the risk of punishment is low. It recedes when those conditions change, and it returns when they shift back. The specific individuals change with every era, and the ships and weapons change beyond recognition. What doesn't change is the underlying dynamic. The most useful thing this history teaches us is probably about the conditions that produce piracy rather than the individuals who practice it. Every major outbreak in history has emerged from a specific combination of economic pressure on seafarers, weak enforcement of maritime law, and concentrated trade routes offering rich targets. Remove any one of those three factors, and piracy becomes less viable. Add all three together, and it becomes almost inevitable. The history is, in that sense, the instruction manual. What the ocean's history of piracy also demonstrates is the limits of purely military solutions to fundamentally economic problems. The suppression of Somali piracy through naval patrols worked in the short term, but the conditions that produced it, a failed state, a destroyed fishing industry, extreme poverty in coastal communities, were not addressed by warships. Piracy in the Gulf of Guinea has continued to grow despite naval attention, partly because the underlying economic pressures driving it have not been relieved. The lesson the Golden Age teaches, that piracy thrives in the gap between trade and governance, applies as directly to the modern ocean as it did to the Caribbean of 1715. Pirates have always been part of the ocean story. They were there in the ancient Mediterranean, in the Viking Age, in the Caribbean Golden Age, and they're there today in the Gulf of Guinea and the Strait of Malacca. The ocean has never been entirely safe, and the history of piracy is ultimately the history of the tension between trade and the law that's supposed to protect it. In our next episode, we go deep into the ocean's geological and biological past to explore the 5 great mass extinctions, the catastrophic events that have periodically reset life on Earth and from which the ocean has always eventually recovered. Until then, thank you for listening.